Welcome to this special conversation with Angela Rae Clark, this conversation about human trafficking. This is Stephen Carter, and I'm a committee member for the FREA organization. FREA is short for Finding, Recovery, and Empowerment from Abuse. FREA is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping abuse survivors recover and thrive. This month is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. Angela knows firsthand about this horrendous crime, and that's why we're having this conversation. Angela is also a FREA volunteer, and she is a committee member as well. Welcome, Angela, and thank you for sharing the important information that I know that we'll be talking about.
Well, thank you for joining me on this important conversation because Human Trafficking Awareness Month is pretty big in my world, and it's important to me because I'm a survivor of trafficking. And you did a really great blog post, so I am going to encourage people to go click on the link that we'll provide below with the blog post that talks about some of the statistics and some of the populations that are represented in the trafficking movement. And this is what I know. So I knew that I was a survivor of trafficking for several, I probably knew the phrase for probably 5 years. And then in January of last year, I was connected, serendipitously, of course, to National Survivor Network, which is a network of trafficking survivors. And they're professionals and consultants and speakers and leaders, and they're active in showing up in different capacities to be able to be part of the change that needs to happen to keep trafficking from being a billion-dollar industry. You had a statistic in there, and I don't remember what your number was. I think it was 150 billion globally annually, or something like that. Anyway, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, whether you're talking just the United States or you're talking about a global amount. It's staggering to me, the amount of money. I've heard regularly $32 to $36 billion annually for the trafficking industry. And that's an incomprehensible amount of money to me. And so the other thing, so I'll just share some of the things that I've learned over the last year. I've attended 4 human trafficking conferences and participated in 2 of them as a leader. And what I learned is that there's 26 different types of trafficking that they've identified. So we're covering labor and sex trafficking. The other thing that I learned was that my story is actually the biggest part or segment of the population that's been affected by trafficking. Labor and sex trafficking. It is most often our traffickers are family members. And so we call that familial trafficking. Oftentimes in regular, conversations or news articles that I see, whether it's print or it's, online, it's all about the 12 to 14-year-olds that are a vulnerable population that are brought into a trafficking situation. And we can talk more about that in a minute. But that's not the majority. The majority of people being trafficked for labor and for sex are trafficked by our family members. For me, it was my grandfather. And I was 5 when he started. He was one of my caregivers. I had a single mom, and he lived nearby. And so for him to, take me on an errand around the county with him, or, he just had access to me. I was still going to school. I was still living with my mother I had all of the things that would have said I was in a normal home, and I wasn't. And I've talked to many other survivors that have a similar story, whether it's an uncle or a step parent, but it's somebody that has, a caregiver role that has access to them that is related by blood, but I consider step parents to be that family of origin as well. So I just wanted to talk about that, I guess, and start off a conversation around that. There's, I've been asked in different forums, what would it have taken? Like, did you tell anybody? And I don't think I told anybody. For lots of different reasons. First of all, my grandfather had been grooming me for a couple of years. My first recollection of sexual abuse by him was at the age of 3. And he also, did some torture techniques that were designed to really, make me understand who was in power. And, those are pretty good silencing techniques. Add in that he was also a source of love for me as a caregiver, and he had his, moments where he was just a grandpa, not a trafficker, and that really confuses a child's brain. So when we bring in the bonds of family, that's a natural, vulnerable space that somebody can use coercion without it really being, enticing them with a piece of candy. Like, it's much more subtle than that. And so when we look at trafficking from that standpoint, it's, my next natural conversation that I always want to have is, what will it take to interrupt that? That's why people ask me, did you tell anybody? Because, and I really don't think I told anybody. It would have taken a really serious inquiry, and with a trusted adult, somebody that I really thought could interrupt things and make change for me. Because if somebody can't do that, if they can't deliver that change is really going to happen, then it's, it's an accusation, and it becomes harder for the victims, because the trafficker is going to do a lot to punish, those of us that do try to speak up. So, I would have had to have been confident that some other adult was going to take matters into their own hands and really make change for me and remove me from the situation. But add in the layers of family, loyalty, coercion, the torture that I endured. I don't know that you could have pried my mouth open to report. So in that way, that's a hard conversation. How do we fix this? How do we solve this? So then another conversation that we could have, but it's not a very long conversation for me, is, interrupt the buying, interrupt the interest. And there are some really great nonprofits doing some good work in that regard. And it's when people get arrested for being a purchaser that they are then required and mandated to go to a re-education class. And they have some survivor of trafficking come in and say, I wasn't there by choice. You thought I was there by choice, but I wasn't there by choice. That's a common misperception. And so that's part of what survivors have been able to do in the movement, is create the backstory that helps everyone understand how this got to be such an epidemic proportion. We've already been through this with child abuse and with domestic violence, and so trafficking is just the next layer that's been hidden and in the shadows for far too long. So
you had mentioned that, unbeknownst to most of us, that familial trafficking is the biggest piece on the pie chart. What percentage of trafficking or human trafficking is estimated to be family sourced?
Is what?
Estimated to be family sourced from the family.
The almost 40%.
Wow.
Almost 40%. And that's I don't know what the statistic is for. It's a little bit lower maybe for labor trafficking, but not much. It's in the lower 30s, I would say, or upper 20s for labor trafficking. But for sex trafficking, it's almost 40%. And it's as I said, we are vulnerable to our caregivers for misusing us in lots of ways. And labor trafficking, it's just as, I've heard some stories in the labor trafficking realm that just are heart-wrenching and gut-wrenching. So it's just as horrendous to have children that are, sold by their parents into a labor task, labor-oriented trafficking. And then oftentimes, family members are responsible for supporting a family member to come here from another country, but they've completely lied to them on, then they get here and it's debt repayment, which actually happens in the sex trafficking world too, is that the traffickers get, people into this mindset that you owe me, and you're going to be paying off the debt pretty much forever until they're done with you. So
what are experts, and I certainly would put you in that category, what are some of the ideas that have been floated to put a stop, particularly to the familial side, but to human trafficking in general? You mentioned paying attention and really focusing in on the buyers, the customers. Are there other ideas that have been floated in the abuse community, human trafficking community, to put a stop to this?
Well, that's interesting. In the conferences that I've been to, it's been so heavily focused on education, making sure that everybody's got the information that they need, and then they are developing protocols. Like in hospitals, they're developing protocols still, so that if somebody shows up in the emergency room, how do they, get the right people that are equipped to work with a survivor that's, probably currently in the situation, into that exam room before that person decides to run, or their trafficker decides to, come in and take them, remove them from the room before they can have a conversation and hopefully help that person choose to leave. So I think we're so focused on education that there's not nearly as many conversations happening yet about how do we really interrupt this. So my own personal thoughts are what I will share with you, and that is that we've just with the Me Too movement, we've been able to break silence, which that's huge, and that breaking the silence about all the dysfunction in our family systems, that's one of the first steps that we're recognizing now, just how vulnerable our kids are to all sorts of things, to addiction, to abuse, to trafficking. And so I think a big part of the solution is going to be figuring out how to be better parents, how to be better teachers, how to be better adults that are, whenever we're working with kids, that we're actually listening to them rather than telling them what to do, which is what I feel, I was raised with the being told what to do, but not, being part of that conversation. And we just didn't know better back then in many circles, certainly not in the rural part of Iowa where I grew up. It was just the way we did things. And so by becoming, evolving as humans, really, and recognizing that our children really are looking for validation and love. And if they can be so easily enticed by a stranger that says they love them, that's really where that's one place to repair. But as I said earlier, the flip side is we have to do something. The adults that are out there spending billions of dollars on buying humans for sex or for work, that's the other piece of it that needs to be addressed. And quite honestly, that's overwhelming to me to think about how we go ahead and impact change there. But, what I've seen are, and heard and met some people from great nonprofits that have developed some ideas, and they said they're very effective. And they really don't think that those people that are going through the re-education classes are reoffending. Nobody's had to take the class twice, which is good news. The bad news is, to me, it's been a really small percentage of the population that's had to go through that, because they do sting operations every so often, but it's every so often. And they might catch 20 or 30 or 40 in a sting operation. And that's a small number of the people that need to go through this rehumanization of who it is that they're trying to buy. So that seems like slow work to me. Mm-hmm. Really slow work. So in the meantime, I guess that's what we are all doing in the survivor community, is we're staying busy with getting out there and talking about it publicly as much as we can to start bring awareness about the different ways that people are trafficked. My invitation is for anybody who thinks they see a child that's, enduring abuse of any kind, to be the brave one, the courageous one, to step up and report. And then, my hope is that the law enforcement and the social work people they're resourced enough to be able to ask the right questions, to be able to understand a child of trauma. That story may change several times, and because of all the different factors influencing, a child being asked questions about what they're enduring that is been so privately held before. So trauma-informed care and survivor education, that's really where the work is right now. And I would love to see it in my lifetime, that trafficking didn't really exist anymore, that it wasn't at epidemic proportions. And that's my hope. And it might be a little bit Pollyanna. I don't know.
Well, you're doing marvelous work toward that goal. So I do want to say thank you for that work. And as we kind of wrap up, is there any key piece of information that you would like our audience to know as far as this issue is concerned, or anything else?
Absolutely. Well, I think my message, this is where my specialty is, much more than the statistics. I always have to refresh my memory before I go to present in case I get asked, what are the numbers? And some of it I've committed to memory now. But my specialty is talking about the fact that recovery is possible. And that's how I landed in FREA, is because many of the tools that we have available on the website at no charge are the tools that I used in my own personal recovery, so that I wasn't stuck in my wounding of being trafficked. And that, to me, being able to come into the room and present and actually teach people some of those tools is invigorating for me, because they're really important for self-care, no matter what you're navigating, whether it's grief or pain or loss, or being a survivor of cancer, or being a survivor of domestic violence or abuse of any kind, or a survivor of trafficking. Recovery is possible. And it's that hopeful message The more that we empower people to be advocates for themselves, the less they're going to be vulnerable to being taken advantage of again in some other way, even if it's not a trafficking scenario. If we can empower them with a strong sense of self and the tools to interrupt, when we get that trauma brain that goes and takes us off or freezes us up, if we can interrupt that to me is empowerment. And that's why I'm such a big fan of FREA and the resources that we have on the website. They were life-saving tools for me. So I appreciate that.
And the FREA address for the website, and for those listening, my apologies for my voice coming out after quite a cold. And that website is FREA.support, FREA.support. There's a ton of great resources on that site, and both Angela and I really do encourage you to visit that site, whether you're a survivor, whether you're a caregiver, or whether you are simply looking for ways to deal with trauma and stress. Wonderful tools, self-help tools, first aid tools for trauma. And if people want to learn more about you or get in touch with you, what is your website? How can they do that?
My website is AngelaRaeClark.com, and that's Angela, R-A-E, Clark.com. And there's a contact form on there that they can use to get in touch with me. The other thing I will say about the resources that are on the FREA site is they are self-help resources. I don't know if I said that earlier, and I just wanted to emphasize that they're self-help. And that's what I needed when the first time I went to a victim justice conference quite a number of years ago now. I found myself triggered right out of the gate, and I didn't want to miss the whole day. The keynote speaker that I had really wanted to see was at the end of the day, and so I went down the hallway, or down in a corridor, and public places where you can get just enough privacy. So I was able to work on myself, and I was able to go in and enjoy the rest of the conference and learn from it, which is why I went. And I got to stick around for the end of the day to see the keynote speaker. So us being able to practice them and take care of ourselves, that's how we arrive at healing. It's not by, our weekly therapy sessions or coaching sessions are imperative too. And it's when we take a moment to take care of ourselves, that's what really brings us into a space of recovery. So check out the website, and if you're have any questions on the website, there's a contact form on there too that people can reach out and ask us questions, and we're happy to respond to those. We have a wonderful executive director. So,
indeed we do, and that website again is FREA, FREA.support. Angela, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for sharing your story, for sharing your perspectives, and giving us and giving me some information that I simply wasn't aware of. And I've been studying this area for quite some time, even extending back to my days as a police chief. Thank you, and blessings. So, again, for those of you who are joining us, thank you for watching. Please be safe and be blessed. And if you'd like more information, you know where to come.
Thank you, Steve.